On today's episode of What the Ship, a close call in the Panama Canal. We have updates on the bulk, container, and tanker sectors, and how the Silicon Valley Bank bailout could solve global security problems along with the logistics fight in the Pacific. I am your host, Sal Mercogliano. Welcome to this week's What the Ship. Top 5 maritime stories for the week. A lot going on. But first, before we jump into anything, I want to do an update on a story that just came out, and then we'll jump into this week's news. If you're new to the channel, hey, take a moment, subscribe to the channel, hit the bell, so you'll be alerted about new videos as they come out. All right, let's go ahead and jump into our update and then our 5 stories. So last week I ran a story about Chinese cranes. New York Times came out with a story regarding this issue about how Chinese cranes could be used to spy on the United States and potentially talk about the movement of cargo within the United States. Did the whole video on it. I'll have a link in the show notes and up above there for you, right above here, so you can link over to it. But what's interesting is the American Association of Ports came out with a statement, and I thought their statement was fairly interesting, so I want to read part of it. So again, industry vigilant on integrity of ship-to-shore cranes. Port industry affirms integrity of safeguards around foreign equipment at seaports. Says pulling the plug on otherwise secure equipment would be strategic misstep. Instead, U.S. should pass Cranes Act, reshore strategic manufacturing. So, American Association of Port Authorities, been around for 111 years, gives you a little bit of their background, but this is what they basically say, because they wanted to clarify recent reports. There's been no known security breaches as a result of any cranes at U.S. ports, despite alarmist media reports. I guess I was alarmist here. Further, modern cranes are very fast and sophisticated, but even they can't track the origin, destination, or nature of the cargo. That's not... Okay, let's be clear about this. Number one. Okay, there's no indications of a security breach as of yet. Okay, great. That doesn't mean it can't happen. And nowhere in this statement, by the way, do they say it can't happen. But then they talk about the fact that it can't track origin, destination, and nature of the cargo. No, it can't. But again, what it can detect is what containers are coming off, the volume of containers, what ships, and using other software and other material, you can track and detect what is coming in and out of the United States, potentially in a much more visible way than, for example, you can do commercially. And that can give China some advantages. And that's one of the issues that they're talking about. It goes on here, China has subsidized crane manufacturing in a way that makes their cranes cost half the cost. Okay, that's the issue right there. Because China is undercutting everyone to get a foot into these businesses. And again, the issue I raised, and not alarmist at all, is the issue of cyber on these cranes. The fact that these cranes have to uplink and get firmware updates for their software makes them vulnerable all the time. There's a statement here from Kerry Davis, who's the AAPA's Vice President and General Counsel. I like a good spy movie, but you need a smoking gun to make it a blockbuster. There's no smoke in this story. True, there is no smoke. But again, this is called investigative reporting. This is not talking about a blockbuster. It's not talking about every crane, ZPMC crane, going offline. It's warning about a potential for issues regarding those cranes. He goes on, but remember the image of the powerful middle American factory in the movie Deer Hunter. Okay, I don't know why we're going back 50 years to a movie that most Americans probably know nothing about, but okay, let's see what he has to say. Just picture American factories churning out world-class, connected, low emissions, and user-friendly cranes, trucks, and tractors. That's the opportunity we have here. Okay. Listen, I love the idea of onshoring, building our own infrastructure. This is a great thing. But no matter what you do, the Chinese are going to undercut you. And that is the issue here. And they are going to continually lowball and come in well below what Americans can do. And this is what we see. And when outfits like Cato and other few others talk about the idea of free trade and free commerce with other countries, they typically leave out the fact that these countries that we're competing against are highly subsidized and they basically don't pay anywhere near U.S. wages, which in turn creates a problem. It goes on here a little bit because I want to be fair to the AAPA. AAPA has dedicated tripwires for anything that could threaten port operations, including a technical committee on security and safety. The committee has reported it takes very seriously the concerns raised about Chinese-made cranes operating at U.S. ports, yet they talk about media hype and media hysteria in the previous statement. In partnership with federal, state, and local law enforcement, ports have taken steps to detect and mitigate potential risk posed by these cranes. To the best of the committee's knowledge, no kinetic or cyber incidents involving these cranes have been reported in the United States. Well, yeah. And, you know, Jeffrey Dahmer was a nice neighbor to his neighbors up until the point they discovered that he wasn't. That is the issue you have. It's great to sit there and say there's no problems, but even the AAPA is noting that we're taking the issue seriously. They shouldn't poo-poo the story about the potential here. This is an issue that needs to be done. Again, all you got to do is look back at Maersk and the attack it took on cyber attack back in 2017 by the NotPetya virus, or all the cyber attacks that happened over the past 2 years against shipping firms. This is a serious issue that should be dealt with. All right, let's go ahead and jump into story number one. Story number one, it's March. That means somewhere in the world a ship is going to get stuck in a canal. This report was a really scary one, I have to tell you, because of the potential implications associated with it. So this is a Lodestar story. It's posted over at gCaptain. Close call in Panama Canal locks raise security concerns. The OOCL Utah's near collision on Sunday with a Panama Canal lock gate suggests a tragic and costly accident is waiting to happen. And so you'll see the O lane of the Panama Canal here. The twin lanes of the old lane are right here. They're moving here. This is the new lane. And the new lane is much wider and much longer, meaning you can put much bigger ships in it. So this is the new container ships that are being built in record number, what are called Neo-Panamax vessels. And here you see the 3 locks. It takes 3 locks to get up onto the Panama Canal, across Gatun Lake, and then 3 locks to get back down. And here you see the locks. The gates are right here, twin gates. They retract back into these houses here. And then you fill or pump in water. Here is reclaimed water that is used. One of the interesting things about the new Panama Canal is it reclaims about 80 to 85% of the water it once just spilled out into the Atlantic and Pacific. There's a big issue about water levels on the Gatun Lake falling. But this issue involved a ship narrowly hitting one of the lock gates. And one of the things that's different about this lock than the other ones is the old locks had what were called mules, little tiny electric trains that pulled vessels through the canal. The new lock doesn't have it. It relies on tugs for this. And here is the video. This is the OOCL Utah. You can see it moving toward the lock here. It has a bow tug, the alpha tug, right here on the bow. What it's missing is the delta tug, a tug on the stern. Cut that out. So there's no tug on the stern to stop the movement of the vessel. You really don't want to use ship engines all the time for this because of the wake and the propulsion it does, and it's not always as good as tugs. You want to use both, actually. But here you have a situation where this tug is caught between the bow of the vessel and the lock gate, which isn't a problem. That's you'll have that with vessels kind of caught in the notch, so to speak, between the bow and the vessel. But what you see here is the vessel moving forward. The big bulbous bow right here is coming very close to the lock gate, but this is where the video cuts off. Representatives of the Panama Canal Captains and Deck Officers Union told Lodestar how a lack of procedures and under-resourcing by the Panama Canal Authority left pilots paid per vessel calling the shots. Quote, "They, the pilots, want to finish fast because the more assignments they get, the more money they make. The fault cannot be attributed to the ship. The pilot was told the stern tug was coming from another job, but chose not to wait. There were no procedures and no regulations, so the pilot can do whatever he wants. This is the closest call we've had so far in a train of incidents over the past 2 years. In one, a tug was put aground, another put on the rocks and out for repair for 3 months. We can say the crew was in jeopardy because of the enclosed space and the size of the vessel. If the ship strikes a tug, it's going to go under. There are no ladders. The tugs themselves are death traps. But if you fall in the water there, you're going to be sucked under." So, a couple of key differences here. Panama Canal. On the Panama Canal, the ship's pilots take command of the vessel. They relieve the master of responsibility. It's not like the Suez Canal. In the Panama Canal, those pilots are responsible. And the fact that you use tugs in the new lane, vice mules, means you have to have tugs on both the bow and stern to control the entrance of the vessel into the lock gates. Understand, you can use one tug, but you have to move very slowly and check the movement of the vessels. And it's very difficult to do with just one tug. And so I'm going to be interested in hear the feedback on this from pilots I know in the Panama Canal. The Panama Canal Authority just recently raised prices. If that ship hits the gates and knocks the gates out, that is catastrophic to world shipping. You're talking about closing the new lane of the Panama Canal. All you got to do is take out one lock gate and you're done, because you can't move anything after that. You're talking about those ships of 15,000 TEUs now can no longer get to the East Coast and Gulf Coast of the United States. Remember, the large majority of cargo has shifted from the West Coast to the East and Gulf Coast. This could be catastrophic. And fortunately, that did not happen. All right, let's go ahead and jump over to story number 2. Story number 2, we're going to talk about the bulk trade, but particularly coming out of Russia and Ukraine right now. This story from Bloomberg, Turkey blocks sanctioned goods to Russia. Turkey abruptly stopped the transit of sanctioned goods to Russia this month as the European Union and the U.S. pressure allies to support measures imposed over President Vladimir Putin's invasion of Ukraine. The government ordered a halt to transit of such goods via Turkey from March 1 in compliance with sanctions, said a senior Turkish official. Turkey has emerged as one of the havens for Russian wealth and a center for sourcing goods. Over the past year, Turkey's exports to Russia rose to $9.3 billion in 2022 from $5.8 billion a year before. So we're seeing Turkey enacting issues regarding sanctions, which is different than what we've seen happen before. Understand, Turkey is really relying on Russia for key commodities, including oil and wheat for conversion into flour. Turkey makes 40% of the world's flour. Go on here, we're coming up on the latest renewal of the Black Sea Grain Initiative. Within days, we're going to see, it's about a week or so, we're going to see the Black Sea Grain Initiative come up for a revote. And one of the key elements in here is Turkey. If Turkey is not involved in this, this falls apart. It was actually Turkey that basically brokered this, more so than the United Nations, I would argue. But again, Ukraine and Russia both benefit from this. And if you want to follow what's going on with the Black Sea Grain Initiative, you want the best sources, you can go over to the UN site, really recommend it. But there is a source on Twitter I find absolutely essential. Exit266, at Exit266, posts daily updates on the Black Sea Grain Initiative. And I'm not just talking about tonnages and updates like this. I'm talking about she and a host of other people are putting together some absolutely essential data on tracking what is happening here. So you'll see right here, this is the post, 8 days left in the Black Sea Grain Initiative, how many vessels are outbound, how many vessels have delivered cargo, and then you get a slew of charts available that breaks it down, great spreadsheets on data. You can go through them all, and the amount of data here is just absolutely amazing. That you can find on cargo, where it's going, who's getting what commodities. Really some good, hard data so that you can look at what is coming in and out of Ukraine. There's not data on Russia, but there's data coming out in Ukraine. And we should also be talking about the fact that Russia benefits greatly from the Black Sea Grain Initiative. They get a lot out of it because their ships can freely flow out of the Black Sea. And in some cases, they are hauling Ukrainian grain in their vessels that have been seized from some of the occupied territory. This is the issue, I would argue, you need to be watching in Russia-Ukraine, because what we're going to start seeing is a downturn in the amount of grain coming out of Ukraine because of the war, because of the attrition, and that could be the economic issue that's going to undercut the Ukrainian ability to maintain themselves in a war. If their economy collapses, if they can't get their grain exported, that's going to be an issue we see going on. All right, let's go ahead and jump over to our next story. Our next story deals with the tanker market. Man, if you have been following tanker stocks this past week, holy cow, what a roller coaster of a week it has been. Week before last, everything in the green. This past week in the red. It's been up and down. It's been just crazy watching what's going on. And it has a lot to do with, of course, the Russia-Ukraine, which is having a huge impact on this. So a couple of stories to take a look at here. One, Russia crude exports by sea slide as lucrative Pacific trade declines. Now, we're coming out of February into March here. And so that means that pretty bad weather on the Pacific coast of Russia bringing out crude oil. And that's probably accounting for a large bit of that, although we do know Russia cut back on some of its crude exports. A Couple of key charts here. Here is Bloomberg's story on tracking the 4-week average of crude shipments from Russia by destination. And what's really interesting here, this goes back again over a year. You can see how low it is on crude shipments. But again, this is by sea. Remember, a lot of Russian oil shipments went by pipeline into Europe, for example. That got cut off. And now what you see is that shift. Look at where it's going. China still basically holding fairly level at where it was. A lot of people are talking about how China's buying all of Russian crude. It's not. The one that's changed dramatically here is India. You see how India has taken over a huge amount of it. India is the big player emerging on global shipping right now, not just in the tanker market, but also in containers, I'd argue. As you see a lot of offshoring, we'll talk about this with containers, a lot of offshoring from China to other countries. India has the potential to do it, but India lacks the container ship infrastructure, but we'll talk about that. See India coming in. You can see Turkey emerging. Turkey is great for this. Turkey loves buying Russian crude because they can refine it to diesel and sell it right to Europe, because once you refine the oil, it's perfectly good to do it. And then you'll see the emergence of some unknown nations in here in Asia and unknown players. And I think that's the most disturbing part of this chart. Is the growth of the fact that nearly half the oil that's coming out of Russia is listed here as unknown, where it's going. Go over here to the ship-to-ship transfers. These are the movement. Remember, you're seeing crude come out of the Baltic and out of the Black Sea, but it's going a longer distance than before. And so because you can't bring very large crude carriers into the Baltic because of the draft or the Black Sea, you transfer the oil from smaller vessels, MRs, LRs, into these crude carriers. And what you're seeing here is that being done. So since December, when it kicked in, December 5th, you've seen just the exponential increase of where it's done. Transfers off of Spain, that's Ceuta right there, off of Greece increasing, and you can just tell that this is a major issue developing with Russian crude oil. And we've already seen some spill issues. There was a recent report from Spain of a ship spilling oil out in the ocean. This story from Greg Miller really covers that issue with the tanker market. Crude shipping revs up. Supertanker rates top $100,000 a day. Man, $100,000 a day we've seen as the benchmark for many sectors. We saw the LNG market do it, and now we're seeing it in the crude market do it. Go on here. Great, interesting story from Sam Chambers over at Splash 24/7. Ukraine pressures Greek owners to stop moving Russian oil. There's an effort by the Ukrainians to get the Greeks to stop moving Russian oil. And let me be clear, the only way you pressure a Greek ship owner is by monetary methods. And there is no monetary mechanism the Ukrainians have to stop the Greeks from shipping oil. It is cash for them, and they're going to keep doing it. It doesn't matter who it is. I hate to say that, but it's true. It comes down to pure economics here. Just a ton of information being disseminated about it. I just think it's absolutely fascinating. All right, let's go to story number 4. Story number 4, containers. Got to go back to our bread and butter here. What's going on with shipping? Bloomberg story over at gCaptain. U.S. trade deficit grows to start the year. Okay, not surprising. When you look at the data of U.S. trade deficit, it is miserable. It's been miserable for a long time. And what you see here is how much that the trade deficit increased, particularly during the supply chain crisis. Look at that huge dip down there at 2022. And let me go and draw attention to one key player here in this trade deficit. One of the big issues, and there's a video out right now that I'm watching, I'm going to do a reaction video about, concerning the number of empty containers over in China. Remember, during the height of the global supply chain crisis, one of the things that happened in the ports of LA and Long Beach is that they shifted from exporting. The ratio between empty to full containers changed dramatically. Used to be you would haul for every 1 full container out of LA and Long Beach 2 empty containers. It got to a ratio of 3 to 4 to 1 at some points. The number of empty containers that were being pulled out of the West Coast, to the detriment of U.S. exports. U.S. exporters were complaining that they could not get cargo out of the West Coast because of the priority being given by the shipping lines and the owners of the containers to get those containers back to East Asia to load with goods. And that's one of the issues why you see this kind of growth in the trade deficit to a certain extent, not solely by any means. There are a lot of issues at play here. But now we're seeing this continue at a much higher volume. Look at where it's stabilized, much below 2017 to 2019 levels. Going on here, container imports expected to slowly climb from February low. Well, we know that's going to happen. February, we've seen that happen. This story builds on this from Mike Schuller. U.S. container imports continue to trend at pre-pandemic levels. If we look at the chart put out by Dakar here on U.S. container import volumes, February is sitting there right around 2019, 2020 levels, way below what we saw in 2021, 2022. But again, those are off years, absolutely crazy amount of volume associated. But notice what you see happen from February to March. During the height of the pandemic, we saw it kind of hockey stick up and come back up. What we saw in pre-pandemic years was it fairly level off to a slight decrease and then increasing going into the rest of the year. So where does March fall in this? I'm going to say it's either going to be at same or less than levels. And then the question becomes April. What happens in the April levels? That's the big gauge we're watching right now when it comes to container imports and the market recovery. Global supply chain returns to normal, New York Fed gauge shows. So during the supply chain, the New York Fed came up with a measurement guide that they called, and I'm going to apologize, the Global Supply Chain Pressure Index, the GSCPI. Terrible acronym. Holy cow, come up with something better than that. But what the GSCPI showed was this huge uptick. And they initially put it out when it was here. I remember this. And they said, well, this is the highest it's ever been, so therefore it's got to go down. And it did, but then it came right back up again. And what we're seeing, it's kind of balancing out at 0, which is kind of the set normal it should be. And I'm not sure how good this index is. The New York Fed loves talking about this thing. I just don't know what it truly measures, but I wanted to put it out there because they're using it, is we don't take the time to learn the lessons from the global supply chain crisis of 2020 to 2022, and we just sit there and say, it's a once in a 100-year thing. We don't need to worry about it, when all of the problems we saw were identified in a report 5 years before that in 2015. Be interesting to see what happens. All right, let's go to our last story. So I want to bring attention to 2 articles written by my buddy John Konrad over at gCaptain this week, which I think are absolutely essential, and they cover 2 vastly different aspects, but are linked together. So the first article is this one: how a Silicon Valley bank bailout could solve global security problem. So obviously nobody wants to bail out a bank. I mean, it's anathema. Nobody wants to do this. And there are fundamental issues regarding bailing out a bank, especially one that has the track record of Silicon Valley Bank and everything associated with it. But I want to go down to John's conclusion down here. It's a great article. It's a long article. I strongly suggest you take a look at it. But John, in the conclusion here, talks about it, and I want to just highlight some things. If SVB is truly a systematic failure, we must not only find a deal that works for them, but we must include large banks and shipyards, both domestically and overseas. The people with all 4 areas of expertise in both domestic and international relationships is even smaller. Jump down here. And that plan would be simple. Startups, VCs, venture capitalists, and laid-off tech workers get emergency funds if they promise to pivot from entertainment and social media to rebuilding the foundations of Silicon Valley. Logistics, naval security, and shipbuilding. The heart of John's article here is that what Silicon Valley became was built upon the premise that were the emergency shipyards built during World War II, the Henry J. Kaiser shipyards. And for a long time, that area was concentrated on material construction. It did great things, but then it shifted. It shifted over away from building things to creating things like some tech elements, particularly entertainment, and has kind of lost their way, so to speak. And John goes through this in detail. Don't jump to the conclusion that John Konrad is calling for a bailout of Silicon Valley just because he's talking about tech. This story requires an in-depth read. Don't just jump to the end here and think you understand it. It is a long read, but it is a lot of detail in it. It is a great piece. And then add to that a military version, I would argue, of that article is one that writes this: Logistics Wins War, a deep dive into the war in the Pacific. So I've done a series of threads recently. I'm working on an article on the 6 oilers that held the line between the United States and Australia in the early part of World War II, December of 41 up until August of 42. And I make the argument that it was really these commercial ships taken up into military service that were really essential to maintain the supply line, support the fast carriers, maintain the bases, and keep Australia fueled during the war. And John talks about the modern day, which is, I make an argument, is that's the application of why you should learn that lesson from World War II. And John does this deep dive into this, and he goes into it. He talks about the U.S. military's love for roll-on, roll-off ships. He talks about amphibious ships and the issues associated with them. He talks about the Marine Corps getting rid of tanks. He cites my tweet in there. Talks about the problem with aviation, fuel distribution, which is the topic I'm dealing quite a bit with right now, air superiority and Ukraine, what China is doing, and then goes on here about fast ferries, learning from Boeing, their unmanned technology, and lessons we can learn from 2 U.S. shipyards, NASSCO in San Diego and Philly shipyard. And sealift lessons from Ukraine, logistics as deterrence. It is just an all-encompassing article. It's really good. He quotes John Boyd in here, and he comes up with this idea, what he calls basically POF. And that is basically preposition, off-the-shelf, fast ferries, and how you can use them for a whole variety of different methods. And what we get into here in his conclusion is talking about how the Marine Corps has made the decision to divest themselves of heavy equipment such as tanks and large prepositioning ships in favor of lighter, more mobile forces. I obviously talked about this in my video on the light amphibious warship, their new landing ship Medium. And what he talks about here is air combat and logistics have an uncertain future, but the aerospace lobby continues to be powerful, influential, and well-funded. If we are going to move forward, we must learn from and not fight the aerospace industry. Lessons from Boeing and Acre have demonstrated the benefits of collaborating across nations for design work and critical parts to minimize time and the cost of construction. Jump to the end. Overall, the article presents a compelling case for the importance of logistics and innovation in the field of shipbuilding and transportation for national security and global stability. I think what John gets to in both of those pieces is how do we put attention into fields like shipping, for example? Where is the shipping Shark Tank? Where are the Genesis labs, the innovation labs that we can do? There's no really drive to venture capitalize and invest in shipping firms in the United States because of the slow return. And so we need to do something to get both commercial and military, and I would argue John makes a great case on the military side, how the military has really opposed that. Military has not really embraced this except in certain areas. They were definitely against it when it came to shipping. And I make the case very strongly that the U.S. military, particularly the Navy, drove the U.S. Merchant Marine out in the post-World War II years to the point where they thought they could rely on what was available, what was left. There will always be someone there, and there wasn't. And these 2 stories make a very interesting, compelling case. Of course, they'll be in the show notes so that you can read them. I hope you enjoyed today's episode. If you did, take a moment, subscribe to the channel, hit the bell so you'll be alerted about new videos as they come out. Leave a comment, share it across social media, give it a thumbs up, and if you can, support the page. How do you support the page? Well, you can hit super thanks down below where you can give directly to the page, or head on over to Patreon, become a patron of the page, a monthly, yearly subscriber. My patrons are fantastic. They give a lot. They don't ask for a lot, which is amazing to me. I appreciate it. They let me do this. It allows me to have the time and effort to put this channel together, to do the research, to get the subscriptions, to do all the stuff behind the scenes that allows me to put together for you a 30-minute video every week that gives you an update on what's going on with shipping and features throughout the week on my channel. If you haven't checked out the channel, please do so. Make sure you check it out. A lot of videos being posted about every other day, about every 2-3 days usually. This is Sal, signing off.